Welcome to Season 3 of the United by Coffee podcast, where our mission is to unite the world through coffee. I'm Christy Ross with my fabulously talented co-host, Greg Hess here.
Hey, Christy, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Greg is a successful podcaster, writer, and comedian who has infiltrated Hollywood.
I think infiltrated might be the right word. That also sounds like a really good brewing method of coffee. Maybe we'll find out about infiltration today with our next guest.
Okay, so today we get to talk to two incredible humans who not only import a lot of tremendous green coffee, but also do good around the world. So have you ever traveled to another country where you have sort of had this opportunity to build homes or help a community get access to resources?
You know, I've been to Haiti a few times. It's been many years ago now, but those were amazing experiences, and I've worked on some Habitat for Humanity builds. But, you know, it is something that I would love to do more, and I'm really excited to hear about, where in the world some of this coffee is coming from and the stories behind it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, these impact trips, like that's on my bucket list for sure. We have our U3 Coffee Bank, which is our charity arm, and I can't wait to actually organize our first impact trip.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit to me? What is the U3 Coffee Bank?
Yeah, sure. So U3 Coffee Bank, it's our charity arm, and we currently have three main focuses. One is we strive to have a social impact. I'm gonna say it behind the scenes, from empowering females, non-binaries, minorities in coffee. Number two, elevating other coffee entrepreneurs, because a lot of these are small business owners that just really have this amazing passion for coffee. So helping elevate them and amplify their stories. And then three, aiding farmers in sort of non-traditional ways, including traceability. We have a traceability initiative using and focusing on blockchain to ultimately allow customers to tip the farmer when they tip the barista, to bring awareness to inequities in the industry, and more. But it all is, it's a good start. Those are some of the things that we're working on right now.
Yeah, oh, that's amazing. Well, sign me up for the first trip. So let me know when it's happening.
For sure. You're in. Well, today we have two coffee experts I'd like to introduce to you. They were one of the first groups I had the pleasure to meet in the coffee industry right here in Chicago. Please welcome Jake Elster, CEO and co-founder, and Ben Heins, Director of Sales and Licensed Q Grader for Crop to Cup Coffee Importers. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning.
Hey there.
Hello. All right, so I want to give a little bit of background on you guys. Jake, your educational background is in anthropology, international development, and in the humanities, all which seem to sort of fit the whole world of coffee. You also completed a master's degree at the same time Crop to Cup was launched. And Ben, you surely have an entrepreneurial spirit. You developed and commercialized a new beverage concept, ready to drink coffee, as co-founder of Bean and Body almost 18 years ago. And then I'm going to fast forward. You've been with Crop to Cup for almost a dozen years. And I know there's a lot in between there, you guys. So we're going to jump into that. I'm going to start with Jake. Jake, give us a little bit more background on your journey to and through coffee. Like, how'd you find your way to coffee?
I found myself living in Switzerland, studying there, trying to get a job with the international development community. It's where I met the other co-founder, Taylor Mork. And relationships from there brought us down to Uganda, where we founded a nonprofit called DevelopNet, Rural Internet Cafe. This was directly after our undergraduate. And so we were there doing absolutely nothing with coffee, living in it's kind of a Robusta town. So there was some coffee there. It's a low altitude place in central Uganda called Iganga. And we were there because my interest at the time was public health work, water development issues. And Taylor was on sort of international trade and democracy and capacity building. We were, asked to go and do a project for some connections that we had in Switzerland to go do an audit of a farmers co-op in a neighboring town called Mbali, about an hour and a half, 2 hours away on the Kenyan border. But I think they just trusted us. So they had these two, what are called Mzungus, is what they call outsiders in Uganda. These two young Mzungus that could go and do an audit. And not knowing how to do an audit, we just did what made sense. So we ended up just tracing the coffee where it came from. We ended up commissioning a map to be drawn of the mountain that showed the different roads. Those roads to us looked like rivers and became points of check so that we did flag different coffees as they came down different branches of that river. So as all the coffee flowed down mountain as it does, by the time it got into the warehouse, it was still relatively clear where the coffees came from. So as you go through your normal approval tastings, which is called liquoring in that part of the world, it's really not to taste what's good in a coffee, but to taste what's bad in a coffee, to see what's off contract, right? But as we did that, we couldn't help but notice that some of these coffees tasted consistently much better than others. So as we traced those up, we went back up to the communities, we found that some people were putting a lot of pride into their work and just doing things that they shouldn't be doing based off of the fact that they're getting paid the same as everybody else. Being from Chicago, I came back home and I looked up Intelligentsia, where their sourcer and pioneer Jeff Watts was starting to push the industry towards quality-oriented sourcing as a means of specialty. And I told him my intentions, that I wanted to sell specialty Ugandan coffee. So I had a job here in Chicago, but at my lunch breaks, I would go down to Chinatown and roast coffees. And at night, I would be on the phone with our colleagues from Uganda. We eventually convinced them or they convinced us, depending how you look at it, to take a container of coffee and sell it on their behalf. And it took us a year and a half. We created these little baseball cards, these different, know your farmer. This coffee comes from this farmer. And I believe that traceability was new at that time. Now that's become commonplace, right? But the original observation was that there was an opportunity here to focus on what we now know as the value chain side of the business. So really connecting the gaps between farm and export and the supply chains that could get the coffee to us physically.
Okay, so I want to actually back up for 1 second. At a high level, Jake, can you sort of articulate the timing of coffee?
I would say it started in November of 1989, when both the Berlin Wall came down and the ICO, the International Coffee Organization, dropped its minimum price quota, which enabled there to be coffees traded outside of exchanges. In response to that, certain countries like Costa Rica and Panama needed to focus on different ways of competing with the low cost of production and the low prices anchored by Brazilian production, right? And so they turned to differentiation through not just certifications, but flavors and direct relationships and marketing efforts. So some of the very first, what they call second wave coffees, came out during that period. So these were your Costa Ricas and your Jamaicas, and they were coffees that had a brand, or they were Konas. They had a brand that came from a specific place, as opposed to just being a generic, coffee is coffee, right? And then in the late 90s and early noughts, I think that's when a lot of the efforts of people that were some of the founders of the Specialty Coffee Association, which is a generation before me, really put in place some of the protocols, like the quality evaluation form that we still use variants of to this date, so that there was actually protocol for describing and quantifying the qualitative aspects of a coffee. Come 2006, that's where my story was, right? And at that time, Jeff Watts is just returning back from some of his earlier travels and pushing Intelligentsia forward, which really brought to awareness this idea that coffee is a seasonal crop, that it should be different from place to place and season to season, and really leaning into the value add of that. And I think that started off a series of trends that, now, 18 years later, have sort of matured quite a bit.
When are you going to write your book on the history of coffee production? I feel like I've never heard a more concise and delivery of a history. That was amazing.
Once AI gets good enough.
I know, yeah, for real. Well, Ben, we want to turn to you. How did you two end up finding each other, and what was your path to coffee?
Yeah, my path was an entrepreneurial start. So I like to say I was in coffee tangentially because out of university, these were the days of Starbucks Frappuccino, like hitting the gas station shelves in a big way. And we came out there and we wanted to do something a bit more intentional and probably back off the sugar, just a smidge. And we got down that road pretty far. That was a 7-year project for me. And probably halfway through it, we ended up partnering up with a fully owned subsidiary of a large Coca-Cola bottling organization. And we had this platform and this ability to do something special, perhaps on the supply chain side of things. And once I got out of the fundraising hustle mode, I kind of wanted to know what coffee was, because I had no idea. I was a beverage man. And that led me to the University of Chicago. There was like a supply chain forum. And in that forum, I think there was, I at least remember 2 of the people there. One of them was like the largest supplier of pork products to McDonald's. And sitting right next to him was Jake. And so
you decided to go into coffee instead of pork.
I remember at the end of the panel being very impressed, obviously, with Jake. And I pulled him aside and I was just drilling him about the process, like how coffee actually happens. And one of the primary questions was like, what happens to all that fruit? It's 75% cherry. And we go on this kind of like sidewinding, I guess, pursuit together of figuring out if we could actually use the coffee fruit to create a beverage. it eventually ends up that we're sharing an office together in like a small incubation space, and both running our businesses essentially in the same office for about a year, maybe 18 months, something like that.
Can you both share maybe a brief story of like your favorite origin trip, like where it was, what you did or what made it your favorite trip?
We were in the western part of Uganda. We have a customer who has a gorilla-themed coffee shop, and we're actually on a gorilla trek. And this is the type of woman who had been packing a Yoplait yogurt in her bag for over 2, maybe 3 weeks from the US, and just takes it out and eats it as she puts on a gorilla costume in the wild with gorillas and with the Askari, the soldiers that are there to go ahead and prevent gorilla, scalping and otherwise. So that was there's a lot of small little stories like this that would belong.
I want to know a little bit too about how you find the right farmers and producers to work with, and how you guys decide, which coffees that you're bringing to market. What's the combination of finding the right producer, but also, finding the right customer and person who wants to drink that coffee?
I think I'm gonna merge that question into my response to the previous, because I think one of the answers is you kind of figure out where not to look as a definition of where you're going to go. One of the things I think when I was reflecting on the question of favorite origin trip was I kind of interpreted it as most fulfilling instead of favorite or best experience. And we obviously got started in Uganda, and so we spent a lot of time on Mount Elgon. And if you just look to the west, you're just looking at Kenya. East, thank you. One of those directions. But it shares a border. Mount Elgon is on the Kenya-Uganda border. And forever, we knew the qualities that were coming off of Mount Elgon. And the broad assumption is there's not a whole lot different right across that imaginary line about Western Kenya, but Western Kenya just isn't a place where coffee typically funnels into the specialty coffee community. And so when we got started in Kenya in maybe 2013 or 14, we wove that flag. We asked everybody, what's going on in the Rift Valley? Can we see samples from coffees in Kenya? And the way it's set up, there are multiple factories, but almost all of them are in Kenya's Central Highlands. There's really only one purchasing station of note out west. And 5 or 6 years into this quest, we finally get a coffee from a factory called Shwele that just blows our entire minds. And I just remember that being so cool because that coffee was isolated on the cupping table based on us wanting to be able to support farmers that weren't already being supported, people who were smallholders in situations that wouldn't allow them direct access into a specialty coffee market. And then a year later, we're visiting their factory, Jake and I think we might have had a couple other people in tow at that point, and kind of figuring out what we can do in Bungoma. And it becomes foundational to the work in Kenya. And it exists today as a piece of ongoing work and a place where not many coffee importers are invested. And we are, and we're able to kind of work towards greater access for the specialty coffee producers in that way.
And actually, on that note, when you talk about this and your quest for helping some of these farmers that aren't being helped today, would it be fair to say that sort of the coffee segment that you trade in is considered super specialty? Would you, meaning that is it like these micro lots? Talk about that a little bit, because I feel like for someone to wrap their arms around the type of coffees that you guys are importing, how would you categorize it?
Sure. Well, I think that the best place to start with there is to realize that when we started in Uganda, our first exports, you were not allowed to have more than one type of coffee on a container. A unit of one was one container, right? And so, this idea of microlots is something that ties into the supply chain side of things, how coffees are financed and sold, right? The way that the financing, insurance, and trucking works is that coffee arrives and it's immediately sold 100%. You don't carry it throughout the year. You don't sell one lot to multiple different customers. You certainly don't have 7 different lots on a single container, right? All with different bag markings and otherwise. So there was a lot of pioneering and pushing that a lot of people in my contemporaries had to do to sort of get that. But the other side of that is that lot separation as a strategy. All coffee is a blend, even if it's just a blend of cherries from the same tree, right? How do you make those blends? That is one of the places where we can add value. We're not farmers. We're not agronomists. We can build teams. We can take contracts and use that to mobilize communities around that coffee and to make sure that there's premiums that are paid the way down and that they're reinvested, or to do our best to make sure. But at the end of the day, our expertise is being able to do the second part of your question, which is to represent these coffees to customers and to understand the trends within the market. And on one hand, to buffer so that we don't have roasters telling farmers to go plant a whole new series of varietals right away, or that you must get organic certified, and other things that may not have the farmer's context in mind, right? But also to translate. So absolutely, when you take a look at micro lots, I hear lot separation. I hear intentionality. I hear, most coffee flows down mountain and is weighed out, teared out on a truck, and then the good stuff is sorted through and that becomes specialty. That's not how we work. We work with very intentional coffees, and they're separated from the community level on out. So that is true. However, that absolutely pertains to full container load coffees as well, right? And so I'd say, a decent chunk, if not a majority of our business, are larger volumes. We have community lots, which are mid to large size lots, and full container lots represent over half of the volume that we do, for sure.
That instance we were talking about with Chuele, we really wanted to know why, after cupping for so many years, we finally got this coffee that tasted great. And it was a very strange answer, which was, well, we just had a terrible, terrible year for coffee. And it turns out that if there's less coffee, you might treat it better. Or if you're not over capacity in your factory, the processing steps might happen better off than they would. But the work that resulted from us finding that small micro lot, which was like 30 bags, was doing multiple containers out of Bungoma to support that cooperative writ large.
One of the ones I'll share with you is that we came up, there's a term called psychographics, which you may have heard of through your market research before, but I had not. And that's grouping people together based off of similar values. And so when we did, my capstone was taking a look at what are the psychographics of coffees and some of the major categories, which I still use to this day to understand what conversation, what's interesting about this coffee to the person I'm talking with. So just like the supply chain matters in context and what stories we tell and what value there is, also who we're talking to, right? There's some people that, we call wanderlust, and they just want to experience the world over through coffee. So these are people that want maps and passports and burlap textures, right? And they like the exotics, right? So even for coffee roasters, places like Bungoma or some of the frontiers of coffee where we work, where it's not easy, I think that's where a lot of that comes from, which is also related to underdogs, people that or anti-establishment folks that, really want to go ahead and just support change and structural change, mostly by supporting smaller alternatives. There's health literates, which care about the quality and integrity of food that they put in their body. Organic is a big, indicator for those. But the biggest category, and the one that's been growing the most since I did this research, is foodie. The ones that want to develop their own preferences, their own mental maps of what their preferences are. What is a washed versus a natural? What's Colombia versus Peru, right? And that has been a really fascinating journey to go on, because realizing that what makes coffee fun is the learning process, is a way of us being able to engage anybody wherever they are. It starts with awareness. Oh my gosh, coffee can taste like this. That's why naturals are really important. And I'm sure if you were to take a look at the sales data of where naturals are selling the most, they're in frontier markets. They're in places where people are trying to showcase, hey, by the way, coffee can taste different. And then the second stage of adult learning is deeper understanding. That's coming up with the mental maps and frameworks, the garden bed to plant this knowledge. And then the last one is ownership. When you have your own preferences and recommendations. And I love a Pacamara, or I love this, right? And you start sharing it with other people.
That's really helpful, because I immediately was like, oh yeah, I'm kind of in the foodie category and also in the burlap category.
Yeah.
but I do want to ask, how do you communicate then, the values that, obviously are so important to both of you, both through your international development work and working in Uganda, but how do you communicate those ethics and values back to the producers and farmers that you're trying to partner with?
I'll get to your question, but I like to believe that as businesses start, for any entrepreneurs listening, people really focus on what they're doing and what's different. And then the next stage is they focus on why and their meanings and their intentions and their goals. But I found that as a company gets more mature, the focus becomes on how you work. And for me, that's cultural. Culture is how we work. Quality is cultural. You can see it within a cupping lab. You can see it in a farm, right? You take care of one thing and it looks at another, right? So it speaks. And I say that because it's really ingrained in how we work. And now how we support those over time has to do with sourcing standards and training and making sure that people travel together and get to see this. But in general, we present ourselves to farmers very differently. We emphasize repeatedly that we are not buyers, that we are salespeople. Our job is the marketing, sales, and distribution of their coffee. We have a cost plus pricing calculator. They have access to the pricing. They have access, not only do they access, one of our sourcing standards is that all of our suppliers must receive feedback reports, not just on the qualities of their coffee, but on their customers and the pricing paid, right? So they must have access to FOB export price and to their customers. And because of that, giving a sales report to a series of farmers who have no idea what happened to their coffee after it left, asking if they would hire you again to represent their coffees next year, is a fundamentally different approach. And I think that between that and some of the activities that we do year round, whether it's pop-up cafes or working with roasters who actually want to support community projects, there's more of an ongoing presence that sort of shows through action. Shows doesn't tell, that about the differences and how we try to position ourselves in that way.
So one of the things I saw that you guys are doing is the showroom coffee, which I believe is a separate platform that caters to sort of a niche market where people can buy single pounds of green coffee and roasting equipment and other products for home roasting or new professionals. Like, what were you guys seeing in the market at that time that you guys decided to create this? And just tell us sort of how it came about.
I think there's like a very humble, honest beginnings of this, which is we were building out a new space in New York with a showroom. And that kind of was a piece of the puzzle.
Have you ever tried to roast coffee in a popcorn popper?
Oh yeah, I've started many a fire.
Is there any way to actually roast coffee at home that is a good way? I'm like, there's a million like TikToks about this of like, you can do it at home, and I'm incredulous.
We started with a modified stir crazy. So I remember being
recommend
at
that.
Jake's house off Damon Avenue and going through some online tutorial about how to put it all together. What's really special about being able to do that is controlling the sourcing, the roasting, and the brewing, all while you are a novice in learning coffee, is a very insane experience. It's kind of the coolest way to just dive. It's the deepest dive you could possibly do.
From the perspective, just maybe quickly from the end customer, I guess I hate to phrase it this way, but what do you see as kind of the next thing in coffee, or what's on the horizon? Because it sounds to me like you guys are so intentional about being forward thinking down the road, and not just from a customer trend point of view, but what do you think a coffee drinker like me should be on the lookout for, just as someone who's really curious and maybe hasn't had the experience and the breadth of all the types of stuff that you guys have been exposed to?
The crystal ball question.
Depends what you're interested in. But
I get paid to be optimistic, but I am by nature anyways. I think it's when Jake said, that crop pickup started and an import unit of one was 320 bags, and that becomes valorized. It breaks up. We have more access. I see that continuing more and more. It's cool to me to see the levels of access to ridiculously good coffees continuing to increase. It's very cool in tandem to see shared roasting spaces pop up, and you see roasters climbing this learning curve at an increasing rate of acceleration. And so all around us, we see people having access to great coffees and building pretty wildly good skill sets in a very short order. And then what's nice is it kind of like harkens back to this ownership piece when roasters kind of come into their own and they plant their flag with a very specific opinion, they start to take on this curation of their coffees that I think is really cool. So I think a lot of my personal consumption has gone into this curation model where I'm really loving being on somebody else's journey. And I see that happening more and more. And I hope roasters continue to do that for me because I am all about it. Like I am a coffee subscription nerd. I am seeking it out. I want it. And I think that you think it's cool is why I think it's awesome.
On the sourcing side, I think that you'll see more fermentation and processing. So you'll see a lot more hyphens on your bags, thermal shock and anaerobic this and co-fermented with mango juice or otherwise. It's been a huge trend within the coffee industry that I personally have mixed feelings about, but I think it's here to stay. If you're where sort of the conversations we're having, because where we are is 2 to 6 months ahead of when a coffee even arrives and gets to a consumer, right? And then sort of, when you take a look at sort of harvest by harvest, we're probably a year or two ahead from things coming sort of in more commonly available, right? In that sense, which is not always good. It just is sort of where it is. And right now, the overwhelming emphasis has been on processing, which is good. The science is rather newer, and we actually do have a better idea of what good looks like when it comes to modulating flavors through the handling of coffee, the post-harvest handling of coffees. I think that as people learn, pendulums swing towards extremes, and the most recent trends have been towards co-fermentations and rather extreme processes, which is on one hand great because it gives you some really fun, interesting flavors. It gives us something to talk about, and it puts the farmer in the position of being a chef or the old school viticulturalists. Like they actually are now able to, bottle their own product on the farm and be that person who's adding that value there.
When I think about Americans, I feel like all they want is chocolatey and nutty, and that's where it feels like it ends for the general American. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know.
I think it's generational, is how I think about it, to be honest, Christy. I do believe that, for example, convincing my father to switch from Starbucks, right? It has been, a great example, but it's not just generational. It's really about your exposure too. How, is good coffee strong? It's like when you do a coffee evaluation, you have to differentiate between quality and intensity. Just because it's super acidic does not mean it's lemonade, right? You still need sugar, right? And so that balance is important. And I do think that the more exposure people have, the more they develop their own preferences towards those nuances, and they see that. So I just think it's a matter of exposure, and it's been brought up earlier, the access to exceptional coffees is just always increasing. And so when I say it's generational, I do believe that is what I'm referring to, is that if you grew up starting coffee in the last 3 or 5 years in a major metropolitan area of the US, your access to a wild range of flavors has been much different than my father's was, for example.
I'm going to quickly jump into one question that is really I really want to touch on, and it is on innovative approaches about blockchain, traceability, sustainability, and certainly climate change and concerns around coffee farm sustainability are very, very real. What do you think is the best approach to traceability, and how to showcase that?
It's a massive question, Christy. I'll try to do the very best I can. I will start by saying that it's highly contextual. The other founder, our business partner, Taylor, his background is in supply chain auditing, which is more useful for estates and larger farm contexts. When you look at more smallholder contexts, you have a very different series of considerations that you're looking at, right? For example, land ownership and employees and sort of labor rights, not as much of an issue, although you still have child labor and other issues that come up. So it's a very complicated landscape you're talking about here, right? But if I were to try to simplify it, we have a series of beliefs at Crop to Cup, one of which is trust and verify. So if you just trust, you will be setting both parties up for problems. If you just verify, then you're only auditing. So it's about being very explicit about what your requirements are and publishing your sourcing standards and the steps, the information you'll be requiring. We push for radical disclosure through a process we call informational audits, which is basically just tell us about this. We'll write it down. There's no right or wrong answer. And then we'll come back and see if we can improve on it every year. We do have certain metrics and guidelines that we share throughout our supply chain networks. For example, what we expect farmers to receive when it comes to percentage of export price, what our goals are in that regard, what our processes are in that regard. And then, a lot of it is bottom up, empowering people with the information they need to go out and hold their own leadership and their own organizations accountable. So there's a lot that I'm covering within that. And if I were to go to try to push it forward to the audience for what's going forward, I do think that of all the sustainability issues out there, the one that I think it has the most traction right now, it has to do with financial traceability. I personally am not a huge believer in I love blockchain and I love these technologies, but unless this technology originates from a coffee farming community, we're going to be talking about adoption issues.
I would also say that Crop to Cup is now 11 people big, which feels massive to us, which means we were only smaller in the past. And the guiding principle has been good coffee comes from good people. And that's always served as a proxy. Like, we do not have the wherewithal from a personal bandwidth, technological, or financial capacity to be checking in on every single thing that we would want to from a sustainability perspective. Mm-hmm. But we do have hunches, we do have track records with people, we do have a good sense of who's out there as a good actor in coffee.
The last thing I'll add is we have country level strategies that we publish at the beginning of each year where we take a stance on what we think are some of the priorities and impacts that we can affect on a country by country basis. An example would be in Brazil, it's summed up by grow less and make more. It's in the support of business models, of shifting business models from volume to value, through the support of regenerative agricultural certifications and other sort of proxies like that, right? So, it's really contextualized on a country by country and an annual basis, but that will be the theme of our support in Brazil, has been and will be, even though we revisit it every year.
I think I've read a couple of those. You actually send that out as an email, right?
Yep. So we have pre-harvest plans, which says, here's what we tried last year, here's what worked and what didn't work, here's what we learned, here's our plan for this year, right? That's a pre-harvest plan, and anybody can sign up for that just by going to our website and getting on that. They're also archived in our journals. We are, within the next month or two, getting some new content up on the website that will open up the pricing calculators so that everybody can play around and see some of the transparency in a little bit more of an accessible way. It will also publish our sourcing standards in a way that's easier to find, and puts together all that information in one place. So both.
I want to quickly fit in these last few questions, and there's sort of this, I'm going to call it rapid fire, but we would love to hear from both of you. And the first one is more on I won't say a serious note, but a serious note. But like, if there is one thing you can change in the coffee industry, what would that be?
More companies from growing countries doing what we're doing. So more representation from farming communities, more Indigenous and women specifically who play an outsized role in smallholder coffees. Not just as seats on the SCA board, but sitting in rooms and having conversations. As new generations have grown up in coffee, it's more and more possible.
Great.
I don't have any. I'm sitting in a very appreciative chair. I don't have any like very hot takes about what coffee needs. I see so many good people pushing forward their individual and like very righteous pursuits, and I'm just rooting for all of it.
Another lightning round question: if you could share a general sort of coffee or industry stat, I feel like you guys are the guys to come to for this. What is an industry stat that you find interesting?
Oh, wow.
100% of the people at Crop to Cup are amazing.
I love that.
Just not 100% of the time.
Or is there just a random fun fact that most coffee consumers probably don't know?
Yeah, there's a couple. The first one that comes to mind for me is I used to think that the sweetness you tasted in a cup of coffee came from the sugars that were in the cherry. And that's why the more red ripe the cherry, the higher the altitude, longer the growing season. It turns out that's mostly not true. That actually the relationship between sugars in the berry and in the cup is really translated through volatile aromatics. So diterpene esters. And it's one of the interesting aspects about the aromatic qualities of flavor. And that's why coffee can go baggy or stale over time. It's why a cuppy note can be fresh peaches or dried peaches, right? So that difference when it comes to the vivacity of a coffee oftentimes has to do with its volatile aromatic compounds.
Do you have a coffee tip for coffee consumers? That can be anything from, a grind, a brew, or even just, I feel like you both are so knowledgeable about the ethics and sourcing and things like that. Are there things that leap out to you? Like, if I'm just buying a bag of coffee, is there something I should be on the lookout for that might reflect both my taste, but maybe also value?
Yeah, sure. I'd say that there's been a trend for people to put more and more traceability information on a bag. That trend is moving away now. But one of the nice things about that is it does know that there's a specificity to it, that it's not a blend, right? And that does build some brand equity for those producers. So if you actually see specific producer groups, not just a general region, that is something I would indicate is of a good practice, sourcing practice, potentially good sourcing practice. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I would encourage people to lean into their curiosity. The reality of coffee is that a lot of people are going through pretty great lengths to make this whole thing happen. Yes, it's our job, but a lot of people are in an industry that doesn't really pay them as much as they might make in a different sector. And one of the challenges over the course of Crop to Cup is, well, how do you tell that story? And who do you tell it to? And how far down the supply chain does it go? Does it get all the way to the barista? There's only one way to find out if you're a coffee consumer. Ask.
I feel like diethyl terpenes plus curiosity is that's a good equation for the dynamic here with you two guys.
Yes.
That's right. It's the art and science. It's still
Is this
it really
Oh my God. Coffee curious. Okay, I am going to wrap this up with one last rapid fire question. And what I'm going to do is I'll point to Jake, then Ben. We call it the U3 top 3. So Jake, your favorite brewing method?
Oh, I do pour over Hario.
Ben?
Same. I wish I had a different answer. It would have made for a better response.
However, I've been loving my AeroPress lately. Going through some of the AeroPress recipes, the lighter temperature extractions has been a kick of mine. So I'm even trying my Hario with very 192, 194, 189 temperature extractions, and I'm really liking the soft floral cups I'm getting out of them. So yeah.
In April, Danny brought a bun brewer, a batch brewer that he had Frankensteined in some strange way that I'm not really sure how, but it was fantastic. So that was very cool. It was stepping outside of my normal V60, but it was a wildly good cup of coffee.
Very nice. So a new wave bun brewer. Done by who?
Oh, this is
There's a community online that are all about refitting old bun brewers in different ways.
Okay.
And same with old burr grinders to make these sort of dinosaur Frankenstein machines.
Of
So
course, it's so cool.
Interesting,
this is-
interesting. Okay, so for consumption, coffee or just like coffee of choice? Is it just black, always black? Although I did hear you say you add some milk, Jake, sometimes.
yeah, if it's that bad of a coffee, I need to add milk. No, but no, there's nothing
Got
wrong
it.
with milk. Milk is fine. Milk just changes the composition of a coffee. I drink less and less milk, overall in my coffee. But yeah, I mean, as we are tasting and learning, we absolutely taste black even before. Even if I were to put milk, I would taste it black first. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the classic
Okay.
order is a pour over, a shot of espresso, and a cortado. All three.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we cup so often here. I'm usually just like dumping out like the best cup on the table into like a little glass vessel here and slurping it. So it's typically very light roast, very transparent cups of coffee that are without addition. Yeah.
Very nice. Got it. Okay, last one. How many cups of coffee do you drink per day?
Not many, 2 or 3, 3, 4, depending on the day.
Okay.
I got 2 kids. I'm at the 6 to 8 level.
I have 3 kids. I'm at the 12 level. No.
Yes, that
scales.
follows. That's
Yeah.
linear. I like that.
Well, thanks so much for speaking with us, guys. This was fascinating. And, just to wrap up, we want to give the listeners the opportunity to know where just we can find out more about you, more about Crop to Cup. Tell us where that information is living these days.
Sure. Our Instagram is popular. That you can message us there. That's at Crop to Cup. You can sign up for our newsletter through our website or contact any one of us. There's our team page, so you can reach out to us directly. Or you can stop by our offices in Brooklyn or here in Chicago.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Jake, Ben, we appreciate your time. Love your story. And I am actually going to swing by your Chicago office, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Great.
Thanks, Christy.
Look forward to having you. Thank you, Greg. And thank you,
Thanks,
Christy.
guys.
Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, that was Jake and Ben from Crop to Cup. What an amazing conversation. We want to say thank you to our followers. We want to hear from you. As always, you can reach out to us at connect@u3coffee.com or just jump in the comments with guest recommendations or just your own coffee tips and tricks. We would love to hear from you and what you're drinking.
Again, that's connect@u3coffee.com or head to the letter U, the number 3, coffee.com, where you can learn, connect, and explore the wonderful world of coffee. We'll see you next time.